In 172 BC, in Egypt, a priest named Pagoshan and his wife, Teti Amhotep, signed a marriage contract. It clearly stated what the wife would receive if the two ever divorced. That's right, nearly 2,200 years ago, humans already had prenuptial agreements. We tend to think divorce is a problem of the 20th and 21st centuries. Marriages falling apart from work pressure, social media, or incompatibility. But the truth is, divorce has existed alongside humanity since we first started getting married. From prehistoric nomadic tribes to Egyptian pharaohs to Greek courts to the harsh laws of imperial China, every civilization had its own way of answering the question, when a marriage stops working, what do we do? Join me as we travel through 10,000 years of history to see how our ancestors broke up. Imagine living 50,000 years ago. No house, no land, no bank account. Your possessions are whatever you can carry on your back. So if your marriage fell apart, what would happen? This is the most important starting point for understanding the history of divorce. In hunter-gatherer societies, because people owned only what they could carry, splitting up was easy, the complete opposite of what came later, when divorce became almost economically impossible for farmers, since a couple who owned fields, a house, and a barn couldn't simply split their property in half, and whoever wanted out had to leave empty-handed. In other words, agriculture, the great invention that allowed humanity to settle down and build civilization, accidentally turned marriage into a financial trap. Anthropologists have used a fascinating method to look back at prehistoric marriage, analyzing the mitochondrial DNA family trees of hunter-gatherer tribes that still exist today. The results suggest that marriages in ancestral human societies likely had low levels of polygyny, along with reciprocal exchanges between two families. Things like dowries or bride service, proving one's worth before marriage. Another study on postmarital residents who moved in with whose family revealed something surprising too. For decades, Western anthropologists assumed hunter-gatherer tribes were patrilocal, with wives moving in with their husband's family. But the actual evidence, including strontium isotope data from ancient skeletal remains, shows that matrilocal residents, husbands moving in with their wife's family, was actually more common and more behaviorally normative than previously recorded. This matters because when a husband had to move in with his wife's family, the power within the household and the power to decide whether to stay or leave didn't rest entirely in male hands the way we tend to assume. In short, in prehistoric times, divorce barely needed a process. No property to fight over, no court to rule on it. You simply went your separate ways. But everything changed once humans learned how to farm. About 10,000 years ago, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Mesopotamia, humans began settling down, farming, and building the first cities in history. And along with that came the first legal paperwork around marriage. In 2017, Turkish archaeologists led by Harran University excavated a 4,000-year-old cuneiform clay tablet at Kultepe. Its contents stunned researchers. It was an agreement allowing a husband to take a slave as a secondary wife if his primary wife failed to bear children within a specified period. According to researchers, this is the earliest known historical record of infertility and arguably the oldest prenuptial agreement ever discovered. Interestingly, this enslaved woman wasn't kept indefinitely. Researchers note she would be freed as soon as she gave birth to a son and secured an heir for the family, a strange kind of fixed-term contract we rarely associate with the ancient world. Dowries emerged as a tool to protect women as early as this period. A dowry always belonged to the wife, and if a divorce occurred, the husband would lose it entirely. which both discouraged men from divorcing on a whim and guaranteed the wife a means of survival once the marriage ended. As for ancient Hebrew law, which also developed in this region, the rules around divorce were quite specific and at times brutal. A woman who committed adultery would be drowned along with her lover. Divorce was usually initiated by the husband, but a wife was permitted to divorce her husband for abuse or neglect. Still, the inequality was stark. A man could divorce at will, while a woman had to prove conclusively that her husband had abused or neglected her before she could obtain one. The most common cause of divorce in this region was infertility. But even then, the husband was still required to return the wife's dowry. And here's a very human detail. Many women who wanted to avoid the public shame of a formal divorce simply chose a quieter route, deserting their home, husband, and children altogether. If we had to pick one ancient civilization with the most modern divorce system by today's standards, many historians would point to Egypt. Unlike most civilizations of the era, Egyptian women held a remarkable legal status. Women retained full ownership of their property and income, and husbands had no legal claim over it whatsoever. Egyptian law recognized women as independent legal persons, not as dependents of a male guardian. Marriage here was civil, not religious. It was a civil contract, not a sacrament, which allowed for more flexible legal arrangements. Economic responsibility remained on the husband, while the wife retained full control over her own property. And here's the most surprising part. Divorce in ancient Egypt wasn't only a man's right. A woman could also divorce her husband and send him away. Her rights were equal to her husband's, depending on the type of marriage contract signed. There even exist marriage contracts drawn up by the woman for the man rather than the other way around, strong evidence of the considerable equality Egyptian women held at the time. The actual divorce process was simple and fair. Divorcing in ancient Egypt was as straightforward as marrying, no drawn-out legal proceedings. The terms were clearly spelled out in the marriage contract and generally honored, with one exception: a wife's infidelity. One especially humane detail: children always belonged to the mother and went with her in a divorce, regardless of who initiated it. Egyptian marriage contracts typically ensured the ex-wife wouldn't be left destitute. As for the divorce ritual itself, the husband didn't just declare it verbally, he had to hand his wife a formal written divorce document, signed by 4 witnesses, compared to 16 witnesses for the original marriage contract. The traditional divorce declaration reads almost like a release. I have left you as my wife, and I am leaving you. I have no claim on you at all, and I inform you that you are free to take another husband whenever you wish. Keep in mind, this is a legal document from over 3,000 years ago, a society where a divorced woman was essentially wished well in finding new happiness. Pretty progressive, wouldn't you say? Ancient Greece, the birthplace of philosophy, democracy, and a deeply contradictory divorce system. On paper, both genders had the right to divorce, but having the right and having it be easy are two very different things. Both husbands and wives technically had the right to divorce in ancient Greece, but while it was easy for a man, a wife, or her father had to initiate a formal proceeding and present evidence before a court to be granted one. The most common reasons a man divorced his wife were adultery or the inability to bear children. But the dowry once again served as the real balance of power. A Greek man had to think twice before divorcing a wife who'd brought a large dowry into the marriage, because he was obligated to return the entire sum, or pay 18% annual interest on it if he was the one initiating the divorce. In other words, Greek philosophers could write about justice and virtue all day long, but what actually held a marriage together was money. But where Greece offered contradiction, Rome shows us a genuine step forward, at least by ancient world standards. Divorce in Rome wasn't even new to the Romans themselves. According to the historian Valerius Maximus, divorces were taking place as early as 604 BC or earlier, and the early Republican 12 tables already had provisions allowing for it. Divorce was socially acceptable as long as it was carried out within the bounds of social custom. The process was remarkably simple, almost as easy as walking out the door. Lawful divorce was fairly informal. The wife simply took back her dowry and left her husband's house. Roman men always held the right to divorce their wives. What's truly notable is how the institution of marriage in Rome evolved over time in women's favor. By the time of Julius Caesar, the manus form of marriage, which placed a wife entirely under her husband's legal control, had largely been abandoned in favor of free marriage. Under this arrangement, a wife moved into her husband's home but remained under her father's legal guardianship, was not subject to her husband's direct daily oversight, and her husband held no legal power over her at all. This was one of the key factors behind the relative independence Roman women enjoyed compared to nearly every other ancient culture, and even compared to many eras that came centuries later. And most importantly, the right to initiate divorce was no longer exclusively a man's privilege. Divorce was fairly common in ancient Rome and could be initiated by either party, male or female, which, in its own way, gave women real control over who they chose to be with. The dowry, as always, was women's quiet weapon. It played an extremely important role in divorce and became a way for women to hold genuine power within a relationship in ways previously unheard of. Power that could even intimidate men, a dynamic reflected clearly in the literature of the time. Roman women didn't just have the ability to divorce, they used their own dowries as a bargaining tool. That's a level of financial autonomy that even many women in medieval Europe 1,000 years later still didn't have. While Rome and Egypt granted women considerable rights, on the other side of the world, ancient China, the story was entirely different. The most well-known divorce system in Chinese history was called the 7 outs, 7 legitimate grounds on which a husband could divorce his wife, first appearing in ritual texts from the Han Dynasty. The 7 specific grounds were disobedience to her parents-in-law, failure to bear an heir, sexual immorality, jealousy, suffering from a serious illness, excessive gossiping, and theft. Violating any one of these was grounds for divorce. Notice anything? Not a single one of these reasons has anything to do with feelings. They all serve the interests of the husband's family. Exactly. And that's precisely what researchers point out. Looking at the conditions of the 7 outs and the 3 exceptions, 3 circumstances under which divorce was prohibited even if one of the 7 grounds applied, it's clear that the formation or dissolution of a marriage had nothing to do with the couple's emotions. Not a single clause mentions feelings, because marriage in ancient times was viewed as a relationship between 2 family lineages, with no regard for the personal emotions of those involved. That said, Chinese law did include provisions to protect women from arbitrary divorce, known as the 3 exceptions. If the wife had observed 3 years of mourning for her parents-in-law, if the husband's family had gone from poor to wealthy thanks to her contributions, or if she had nowhere else to go because her birth family no longer existed. By the Tang dynasty, the law had taken an interesting step forward: the emergence of mutual consent divorce, allowing a couple to dissolve their marriage by joint agreement, alongside a separate system of court-ordered divorce decided by the authorities. By the Song dynasty, women were even granted some rare, proactive rights in Chinese history. Song law gave women certain grounds to initiate divorce themselves, A wife could divorce her husband if he had been away for 3 years without returning, if he forced her into prostitution or sold her, or if he was convicted of a crime and sentenced to exile in another region. But make no mistake, these were still rare exceptions. For most of imperial Chinese history, divorce remained an almost absolute privilege of men, and a woman cast off by her husband typically faced severe social stigma. So after traveling through 5 civilizations, from nomadic tribes to Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and China, what have we learned? One thread runs through all of these civilizations. Divorce, whether easy or difficult, almost always revolved around property, not love. Dowries, land, inheritance rights, family honor, those were the real forces deciding who got to leave and who had to stay. And perhaps the most fascinating part is this: the more wealth a society accumulated, the more complicated marriage became. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors, despite having no refrigerators, no internet, when it came to personal freedom within marriage, may have actually been freer than millions of people who lived thousands of years after them. So what do you think? Which ancient civilization had the fairest divorce system in your opinion? Egypt, Rome, or even the hunter-gatherer tribes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.